I bring you greetings from First Baptist of Athens, Georgia, where I serve as their minister to college students. Thank you for this invitation to be here, and it's good to be here on a Mercer Sunday. We are a hungry people. We are a desperate people. Our hearts cry out with longing for more parking. Our morning commutes are like theatrical productions. We crawl down the interstate, and finding our exits, we barrel through stoplights. We perform hairpin turns as we race to work. En route, we rehearse our colorful lines on the interstate and practice the choreography of expressive hand gestures in traffic. When we finally escape the miles of mid-sized sedans, SUVs, and minivans, we are building to the climax of the play, finding a parking spot. For those souls who miraculously arrive with 10 minutes to spare, they may find a spot up on the top level of the parking garage. Those who are racing the clock with just 5 minutes left circle like vultures looking for street parking, promising themselves that they'll actually remember to feed the meter. But those who arrive with just moments to spare, finding no good spots, mutter under their breaths, wishing that it was actually convenient to take the MARTA. And they sigh, and they resign themselves to the fact that the play is dragging on, and they will be late to work. Now, if the morning commute is like a play, then surely the parking situation at McAfee School of Theology is a tragic comedy. Last year, our preaching professor, Dr. Younger, in his YouTube series, This Week at McAfee, even adopted the catchphrase, "Come early, because parking is severely limited." Indeed, our parking lot, in this one way, is like God's love. It overfloweth. Now, many of my classmates choose to go off script for the morning commute theatrics. Some drive trucks, parking on the edge of the woods. Still others strap on helmets and steer their mopeds into the little front half spots at the lot. An even greater number, students to choose to live within walking distance, braving armies of ants and leaky pipes. Now, this whole situation got more complicated last May when Mercer added an interfaith prayer labyrinth on our campus. The labyrinth is a stone maze for people to walk while praying and meditating. And this place of prayer is beautiful in theory, but they put it in the prime space to pave for more parking spots. Now, when the curtain closes on our morning commute and we finally arrive at our desks, the workday begins. We begin planning projects, sorting through piles of paperwork, and trying to check things off of our never-ending to-do list. By the end of the day, we're exhausted. Our morning coffee has long since left us. And in spite of working for 8 hours, we feel more behind than we did the day before. In the rare moments we're at home, we scrounge together meals, wash mountains of laundry, and sob as we try to balance the checkbook. We have so much for which we are thankful: family, jobs, community. But when our priorities become imbalanced, the stress of life and work take their toll. They take life instead of giving life. Our culture has some skewed ideas about success. We're expected to put our jobs before almost everything else. We end up striving after promotions with such intensity that one would think we were being promoted in the eyes of God. All too often, we feed our success, our hunger for success, while ignoring that we are spiritually starving. As a seminary student and a minister, I fall into this temptation too. At times, I prioritize academic success over spiritual growth. During exams last semester, I felt this spiritual starvation with a special intensity. That week, I was overwhelmed with studying for exams, researching for papers, and trying to get things done at church. I'm sure you don't have to stretch your imaginations to conjure up times when you too felt overwhelmed with everything on your plate. Between all of the studying and writing, school was beginning to feel as overwhelming as if I was actually trying to master divinity. I know that this knowledge and these experiences will serve me well in my ministry, but in this season of life, I run the risk of feeding my hunger for academic success and yet being spiritually starved. The Wednesday of that exam week, I made a special trip to church to decorate a bulletin board, chose all my supplies, and I set to work. And I was next to the fellowship hall in the hallway. The fellowship hall was full of people eating lunch. 364 days a year, First Baptist Athens hosts a ministry called Our Daily Bread. Faith communities from across the classic city come together to welcome members of the community who are in need to share a meal. There I was, mid-staple, when one of the guests walked up to me. I felt my mouth go dry because I knew what he was going to say. He's a veteran, and he suffered some traumatic head injuries. But during his therapy, he started reading the Bible. It's a practice he still continues, and now he has large sections of the Bible memorized. So when you give him a verse, he can generally tell you exactly where it's from, and then in turn, he'll give you a verse to go look up. There he was, standing next to me. What word do you have for me today? But before he even finished his question, I knew that I didn't have an answer. My brain was full, but my soul was empty. Looking back on that moment, I recognize that my priorities were imbalanced. I read about God instead of spending time with God. I went to church for work instead of for worship. The success of my day depended on finding a good parking spot and checking things off my to-do list instead of spending time in the presence of God. We do this at times, though. We feed our hunger for success, all the while ignoring our spiritual hunger. All of our responsibilities are important, but when our priorities are off balance, they take life instead of giving life. Now, John tells us that the Jewish people also struggle to balance their priorities. They're focusing on their physical needs instead of their spiritual needs. Now, at first glance, it does seem as though they are seeking after God. This crowd follows Jesus up a mountain to listen to him teach. The next morning, they eagerly search for Jesus, who disappears in the middle of the night. They cross over to Capernaum looking for him, and when they find him, they once again gather around him. But after a long morning of searching for their disappearing leader, the crowds are hungry, and they know that Jesus can feed them. We can almost imagine them whining and saying, "Jesus, we want more bread, we're hungry." But instead, Jesus says to them, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never be hungry. Whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." But for the crowds, these words are nonsense. They follow him, but they still need bread. They listen to him teach, but their cups are still empty. Frustrated, they begin to mutter to one another, "Who does he think he is? Please, I saw his mom at the market last week. Sent from heaven? He's just from Galilee. That's closer to hell, if you ask me." Jesus hears their complaints and their doubts, but he responds by telling them the same thing he said before: "I am the bread of life." Now, Jesus hears their whispered complaints and the rumbles of their hunger. He knows that their minds are far from God and close to their stomachs. Indeed, the day before, when Jesus was up on the mountain with them, the crowds were pleased that he could perform miracles, like the prophets of long ago. Now, they didn't see Jesus as the Messiah, but they knew that he was useful. They began to realize that Jesus could be their Moses. Through Jesus, they too could have manna every day. But Jesus knows their hearts. The Israelites in the wilderness made demands of God. saying, "This manna isn't enough. We want manna and quail." Jesus knows that these people too will continue to make demands. If given what they asked for, they will clamor for even more. They distort the purpose of the miracles. They want them for their own good instead of as a way to experience God. They're doing mental math, adding up just how much these miracles can help them. We can almost hear them saying, "Jesus, pay off my debt so I can send my kid to college. Jesus, heal my mother so she can take care of herself. Jesus, get me a raise so that I can finally afford a vacation." Now, the crowds who seek after Jesus don't see him as the Messiah. They just see him as this miracle man. In finding their miracle man in Capernaum, they hungrily ask Jesus, "What must we do to perform miracles too?" The crowds care about the miracles, the works of God, instead of connecting with God. They value the things that can make their lives easier instead of the things that please God. Even as the people gather around Jesus, they're focusing on receiving presents instead of being in the presence of God. The crowds seek after Jesus for their physical benefit, but they are still starving spiritually. Jesus' teachings are difficult. Hearing their physical concerns, he offers them spiritual answers. And these answers offer truth richer than the crowds can digest. But Jesus cares for them. He pushes the crowds to set aside their misplaced priorities. Now, in Capernaum, some of them stop listening to Jesus because they're too busy worrying about who his parents are. They're sure that he is the son of Mary and Joseph. But in their fixation, they miss the point. Yes, he is human, but he's more than that. The God in heaven sent him. Jesus stops the mutterings of the crowd and tells them, "Don't complain about it. God's in charge. God draws people to me, and in the end, I'll raise them from the dead." As he speaks to the crowd, he reveals more truth. He tells them that God sent him, a truth that they've already rejected, but he tells it to them over and over again. He wants them to know that he has the powers of God, that he can do the miracles of God because he is sent by God. In his time on the mountain and in Capernaum, as he interacts with the crowds, he not only tells them who he is, he shows them who he is. He is the Jesus of the rumors. He is the Jesus who can make the lame walk, who can make the blind see. He is the Jesus who cleanses the skin of the leper. On the mountain, he is the Jesus who gives them all bread. There are thousands of people there, but he feeds them all with just 5 small loaves. In the middle of the night, as the storms rage and the waves crash against the shore, he is the Jesus who surprises them all by crossing the sea. The crowds can't explain it, but somehow without a boat, Jesus crosses the rough water. He is the Jesus who performs miracles, who does the impossible. But he's more than that. Jesus declares that he has the power to raise people up on the last day. He has power over death. He has the power to give life. He is the bread of life. Jesus welcomes the crowds into a life with God. He offers them a connection with God. He hears their demands for bread, but offers them something so much better: the bread of life sent from heaven. The teachings of the bread of life were upsetting for the hungry crowds. Indeed, many stopped following this man who they believed lied about who his parents were and who confused bread with flesh. Now, perhaps understanding Jesus as the bread of life is a weak metaphor for our gluten-free, low-carbohydrate culture. Jesus tells the Jews in Capernaum that he is the bread of life. And for people who used bread instead of forks, it was a part of every meal. Yet, we only use bread to make sandwiches or as a side with dinner. Bread is no longer essential. But Jesus is telling the crowds, I am the living bread sent from heaven. You need me to survive. Jesus extends us the same offer. We need Jesus to survive. In the midst of the chaos of school and work and life, Jesus is our source of life. Jesus tells us to come back to him, not just once in a while, but as often as we eat. Our lives are like a buffet of responsibilities and opportunities, but Jesus is food for our souls. He is the staple food, the boneless, skinless chicken breast of our spiritual diet. In the times that we focus solely on success and forget to feed our souls, Jesus is here with us, offering us nourishment. In the moments when we feel overwhelmed by life, Jesus is here with us, listening to our concerns. And even in the darkest nights of our soul, Jesus is here with us, welcoming us into the divine mystery. Now, I had a heated conversation with God about that prayer labyrinth. I couldn't understand why the school would give us stones for prayer instead of just making our lives easier and giving us more parking spots. But thanks be to God that someone else is in charge of those decisions. I was focusing on the concerns of my life. Yet in times of prayer, in the labyrinth, surrounded by circles of rocks, God reached out and welcomed my ungrateful soul into communion. Jesus' words stirred in my heart, and I once again realized that Jesus is my source of life. God continues to offer us nourishment for our souls. Let us take time in our busy lives to rest our souls in God's presence, to lift our hearts in prayer, and to feast on the bread of life.